Welcome to our final session of the conference today. We've been taking a deep dive into the drivers of change and progress in software quality management in different verticals of finance. And in this session, we're going to be focusing on enterprise testing. And we have three panelists who are involved in very different roles and projects and responsibilities at three different firms. First of all, we have Chandan Narkar from HSBC. We have Ram Narayanaswamy from Lloyds and Stephen Weinberg from Morningstar. And Chandan is responsible for rolling out globally a new human resources management platform at HSBC. That's SAP Success Stories. Ram is going to be talking about his role in testing for KYC compliance, systems for KYC compliance, and Stephen about testing and ensuring good connectivity for Morningstar clients, large and small, and the challenges involved in that. So I'm going to ask each of them to start by talking for 5 minutes or so about those challenges and those projects. Chandan, we're going to start with you. Can you tell us about this massive project that you're running?
Of course. Thanks for the introduction, Matthew. So myself, Chandan Narkar, I am accountable for delivery of all the strategic programs and supporting the production services across HRIT within HSBC. So back in 2015, we embarked on a journey for global implementation of an enterprise HR management system. To give an overview of the program and the size of the scale of it, I'll just set up some context. So in order to deliver the strategy of the bank, improve the shareholder returns and enhance the customer service is one of the goals that the bank has. To reach this goal, the HR function needed, to improve the employee experience and deliver the enhanced services. Now, this demanded a global digital transformation of the HR function to help the bank to modernize and digitize the services. So what are the challenges? The legacy HR processes and the systems were manual, cumbersome, and fragmented across different countries. Bear in mind, it's the world's largest HR transformation program. It is spanning across 66 different countries and over 275,000 employees. Multiple legacy systems were present, which were grown inorganically over a period of 50 to 60 different years. These processes have grown complex, and the employees, the managers, and HR itself couldn't always access what we need. So therefore, a large-scale transformation of the platform and how the majority of the employee population interacted with HR was needed. This was extremely important to increase the efficiencies, lower the costs, and improve the employee, and especially from my perspective, the colleague satisfaction. So this is the program. Now, in terms of the scope, so we had to go for initially a big bang migration for all the employee data, which we call in the SAP world as SAP Employee Central. This includes the employee and the personal data. This was a data migration exercise. This was followed by a number of other products within the HR suite. Typically, all of you must be familiar with the standard stuff like Career Suite. This includes rewards, the recruitments, the global mobility. If you're moving from one country to another, the recruitment and onboarding, the talent and succession management, and finally your team administration. This also includes learning, ServiceNow, where you raise the ticket globally, the data and analytics to get the reports, especially in your career appraisal period, the performance management, and mainly the payroll, the time off or holidays, the paid holidays, and the benefits. This demanded, especially from payroll perspective, a parallel run on the existing systems as compared to the SAP Employee Central Payroll. And lastly, as we move into the digital world, why not have HR on mobile? So we have now delivered HR on a mobile as well. So this was the scope of the program. Now coming back to the challenges. So typically the biggest challenge was the cultural alignment to deliver as one team. We have 5 different pillars, which is typically in any bank business: the technology, the operations team, the change and implementation management, and finally the transformation team. So we need to have a single vision about where we want it to go. The second one is, again, we need to bring in all the teams together, not only have a centralized management model versus a local management model, especially for the operations team who would be looking after the system after it goes live. The next one was the delivery model. So over a period of time, we have used multiple delivery models like waterfall, semi-agile, and moving towards fully agile now. Now think about multiple stakeholders, different languages, and the delivery partners in multiple countries. Think about the coordination across every time zone in the world. We worked in APAC, EMEA region, North American region, Latin American region, as well as the MENA region. And bear in mind, the landscape of the technology and environments was extremely complex. It involved around 200 plus interfaces and a few thousands of different vendors. Therefore, we had to test with multiple third-party suppliers as well. And lastly, but not the least, unfortunate situation for last 18 months, the COVID-19, we had to move to the distributed agile model. The teams were moved across or distributed more than ever due to the remote working model. This was unexpected, unforeseen circumstances, but we coped up with it. Now, enough of challenges, like how did we approach in terms of the strategy and approach from the testing perspective? So first of all, we have started leveraging the lessons learned, or we call it as the retrospectives from agile delivery model perspective from every country deployment. It wasn't a big bang deployment. We went ahead with the phased delivery approach, specifically starting with the biggest countries like UK, moving to China, then Hong Kong, then US, Canada, Mexico, and so on and so forth. The list is endless. The definition of the scope across the bank is one of the challenges with minimum number of CRs that we had to follow. Then second one was the shifting left with early business engagement. Typically, the testing teams are brought in very, very late in the life cycle for software delivery. Here we started with day one. Collaboration with the business and operations team means there was a very, very minimal overlap or a duplication between what the technology tested versus what the business tested. The key change that I have done is automation first approach. We have used Tricentis Tosca as a primary automation tool for all the integrations, all the interfaces across multiple vendors. And I'm very, very proud to say we are around 80% automated across the scope of the program. This is used to conduct regression testing for every change request that comes in or every production defect that comes in. Again, the number of defects have been very, very minimal. This strategy helped us to understand what is the residual business risk so that everyone is aware what is the risk that we are taking. We don't have the time, the budget, and also the support from leadership team to carry out exhaustive testing. Nobody likes it, right? So we need to test appropriately. This demanded the increased breadth and the depth of the test coverage. This wouldn't have been possible without the collaboration across the 5 pillars that I mentioned earlier. So we had to also optimize the delivery model, wherein 95% of the team members were based in the respective countries, specifically India, from cost effectiveness perspective. So this is how we have been continuously improving in terms of the quality of the testing. This is evident in terms of the hypercare that we have. So for example, if you go live with, let's say, UK, and hypercare is typically for 3 months. Over the period of multiple countries, it has been reduced to, let's say, 4 weeks, 2 weeks. And in the last one, we just supported for just 1 week. And after that, the production services team, which again reports to me from the testing perspective, took over. So that gives us the idea of the quality that we achieved in last 2.5 years. Matthew, I think you're on mute.
I beg your pardon. Yes, thank you so much for giving us that background on such a huge project. Before we move on to RAM, just a couple of quick questions from me on this. How, with 66 countries, how many different locations for testing are there? Or is all testing centralized or federated amongst your external partners? Or is there local testing?
Yeah, so you're right. So one is the testing is centralized in India from technology perspective, which is based in, as I said, like 95% of the testers are based in India in 2 different locations, whereas I have some of the team, which is very, very minuscule, based in UK. So we take care of the technology testing. Now, based on the agreement with the business and the operations team, we had to carry out the major heavy lifting of the majority of the testing. Now, in terms of the changing model, when we move to agile and shifting left, we have changed the approach a bit, which means the local operations team who will be taking over from the technology team after go live, they have been engaged right from day one. And due to this, they are like building the system which they will be using in 6 months period. Therefore, the buy-in from the stakeholders is very, very high.
Yeah. And just a final question from me before we move on, and we'll come back, I'm sure, and talk more about the challenges of coordinating testing across the enterprise when we've heard from our other panelists. But you mentioned your Tricentis, your test automation partner. How do you evaluate the impact of, I know we're not going to talk about specific pricing issues, but in terms of building the business case for specific tools, processes, what are the key benchmarks for the ROI when you're implementing an enterprise platform? Because with a customer facing app, obviously you've got customer satisfaction, you've got increased business, you've got savings from automating customer facing apps. What are the benchmarks you can apply with an enterprise HR management platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I joined, there were multiple tools being used for automation depending on which stack we are talking about. So, for example, if you are talking about the web-based channel or SAP SuccessFactors integration model, different COTS tools were used, or we were also using some freewares, or we were using different tools for mobile. In terms of comparison of the industry standard tools, the fintech tools, or the freewares, I had set up a number of parameters in which you mentioned. Top of them are like ease of use, the scripting complexity, the technology that support in terms of the feasibility, whether we are testing the front end, on the back end, middleware, or we are going for end-to-end automation. Do we need to customize the automation framework? Can we reuse it? What's the recovery wizard in it? Are we having object repository? Do we need to have a specific expertise to be developed? Can it handle a number of interfaces? Bear in mind, we had like 300, 400 different vendors that we would be dealing with. Do we have the ability to run the script from any component, or we have to start from scratch? What's the time for development? How it is integrated to a number of test management tools that we have, HPLM, Quality Center, Jira, Confluence, the agile tools that we use. Can we run the overnight execution? Or does it support the batch runs that we have in the night, considering it's a bank? Does it support the CI/CD or DevOps operating model? How it is easy to connect to the tools, ease of availability on the VPN or the local systems. Consider my team is like spread across 50 different cities at this point of time because people are working from home. Yeah. how is the support model provided by the firm, and mainly the licensing cost. All these parameters were considered as a part of the business case that are built in together in terms of the cost benefit analysis. And once we were sure that, okay, this is the right tool, and that's where the decision is made.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and actually we agreed we'd go to Stephen next, because partly because obviously the challenge at Morningstar is a very, very different one, and I'd be very interested in what comparisons you draw with your challenges, Stephen, because what your focus is on testing essentially for connectivity and functionality with your thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of clients. I think it's 9 million actually. Different individual customers of Morningstar, ranging from individuals and of course Main Street, small brokerages in Main Street, right up to the largest asset management businesses in the world. So how do you set testing standards that cover all those requirements?
And a lot of it still follows the same principles that Chandan's talking about. And in his case, he has 275,000 different customers in each of the different employees.
Mm-hmm.
There is 60 years of history of building up different systems, of how they interact, of different practices that have been put in place. So there's a lot of that same sense. I think a lot of us in the financial industry, whether it be banks or financial services, face in that our companies have been around for a lot longer than the newer tech companies. And so we face a lot of that history that brings with it its own challenges. So whether it is, in some cases, we're dealing with desktop applications that have been around for 10, 15 years, and clients are operating them on a variety of different desktops, and we don't really know what their network topology looks like. We don't have control over their operating systems. We don't really even have control over whether or not they've updated to the latest version, or which version they're trying to update from and to. So there are those sorts of challenges with web-based products where we have more of a SaaS model for our products. There's still the challenge of some clients are working with captive browsers. They've built an internal browser for security reasons that may be based off of something like IE11 that's reaching its own end of life, and challenges of support from Microsoft. There are a lot of different challenges with workflow automation tools working with browsers like IE11. And so there are a lot of these different sorts of edge cases that come in. And so figuring out what is the lowest common denominator? Where is there no lowest common denominator? We have to use different tools. And when we are dealing with a bunch of different tools, because in the end, there is no lowest common denominator, sort of the spoiler alert, we do need to have a variety of tools feeding into it. But then how do we make the results visible? And so some of our teams have been doing a lot of work with tools like Grafana and other open source data visualization tools, so that we can feed all of our data into about test results, about test quality, what's automated, what's not automated, test run results into a central source, and we can start to see what are best practices from that. Because one of the things that we run into is, like, it's great to have automation, to have a high automation percentage, but if all of the bugs we find, or not the defects we find, are still being found by manual testing, and the automation is just sort of for peace of mind and regression, but it's not actually finding anything, then the quality of our automation is not up to snuff. And so we need to really then look at what are we missing in our automation tests and our test design, rather than just hitting a standard of suite. We have a high automation percentage. Similarly, as you sort of alluded to, our client bases and their use cases are extremely different. So whether it's an individual investor visiting our public-facing Morningstar.com site, there are things like accessibility testing is a really important piece. And how do we make sure that we're reaching out to the broadest audience we can, and it's not just sort of that stereotypical older, not terribly diverse, gender or racially group that makes up the investor picture? And how do we make sure that we really have the ability to reach a larger amount of people with topical information. When we're dealing with more specific clients, like institutional clients, where they're taking in data feeds from us, then all of a sudden we're starting to talk about data quality at least as much as accessibility and functionality, and figuring out when is tick data delayed, and whether that depends on the client and what their expectations are. So really thinking, like, as Chandan also mentioned, the DevOps, for me, SRE is sort of one of the ways of approaching DevOps and is really important. That idea of internal service level indicators and service level objectives, SLOs and SLIs, and making sure that we understand what the expectations are for, are we talking sub 1 second is just barely acceptable, or is a 20-minute delay completely acceptable? So there's a lot of different levels of information at play depending on our clients, how they're using things, what defines test criteria for success or failure. So it's a lot of different challenges. We definitely do not have all the answers. We're having a lot of fun wrestling with them and figuring out how do we approach that, and making sure that at the highest level, and again, as Chandan was talking about, the different pillars within the organization of expertise. And one of the biggest things from the QA side for us is getting out of the business of QA runs tests and into the business of QA creates processes that give feedback to people who interact with it. And so really looking at everything from where we're looking at risk-based testing, how do we even define what a risk is? Because again, all of this is a wide variety of where is something high risk versus low risk. It really depends on what the release is, what clients are depending on the release, how they're going to approach it, up through our test quality and all of that. So the more we can make that transparent and accessible to developers so they get feedback quickly, it's built into our CI/CD pipelines, that the test automation is not ever run by a human being. It's kicked off by when you do a code merge, to the getting ready for a go, no-go decision around a release, and making sure that product has the clearest view that they can of what business impact is at risk, what is the potential for that, and how do we want to handle client communication so that even if there is no risk and we're confident in it, there's still a change. And for a lot of financial institutions, change of any sort is a little bit scary. And so just because we're adding an enhancement isn't always greeted with joy by our clients. Okay. But that's what we're wrestling with and how we're approaching it. And again, looking at that diversity and large client base from an external perspective, as opposed to in Chandan's case, where it's a much more of an internal perspective.
That's really interesting. And you alluded a couple of minutes ago to the issue of bias, or potential issue of bias, in relation to accessibility. But of course, more broadly, I would imagine that for Morningstar and your team, that AI holds massive potential in terms of automating the interface with customers. And yet you've got to test both for the accuracy of the AI functionality, is the bot giving the right answers to the questions, with this huge issue of bias, which everybody's grappling with, including the regulators.
Yeah, and if folks haven't watched the movie Coded Bias before, just for a look at what sorts of biases are already being built into AI and machine learning, fascinating documentary and approach. But I would say AI and machine learning have a huge potential. We are struggling to make use of that potential. We are playing around with it, we're developing and we're exploring it. We are not at a point where we are vastly realizing that. The closest we're getting to it is in looking at data quality and patterns within data quality, and trying to sort of have smarter understanding of when data change is significant versus insignificant, because a lot of these things, like knowing whether a price quote is accurate or not, or a dividend yield is accurate or not, is a really difficult thing to say no, unless you're a researcher who's intimately aware of it and has 3 or 4 different data sources and sees that, hey, wait, Morningstar's data disagrees with these others. So where we're looking at a single source of truth from our data, it's hard to then say, well, when is this right or wrong? And so some of the working with machine learning, we can say, hey, this changed more than it really should, we need to flag this for a human to review. The other big place we're working with a lot of machine learning is sort of working at fuzzy gathering of data. So where we're gathering data from PDFs or other sort of more document-based data sources rather than data stream, either like APIs, that's a place where we can use a lot of that kind of somewhat robotic process automation, somewhat machine learning and such, to figure out how do we interpret financial documents in order to ingest them more efficiently.
Well, I've been looking to the side, Stephen, because we've got a couple of questions have come in about what you've just been talking about. But to ensure we hear from Ram properly, we'll come back to those maybe at the end of the session. But you've provoked a couple of questions there about how automation testing works in a little more detail. Coming to you, your focus is KYC, which of course is an issue for every financial firm. Please tell us a little more.
Sure, absolutely. I'm Ram Narayanaswamy. I'm a project manager at Lloyds Bank, North America. Just wanted to add a disclaimer here that all the views that are, these are my personal views and not the bank's views. Just wanted to make sure that that's documented. So I was brought here about 5.5 years back for a major KYC rollout, which was already a disaster to begin with. And upon my investigation, I figured out that it was basically the implementation happened locally, which is something new because usually banks buy off-the-shelf product and then deploy it locally. But due to budget constraints, what we did was we started to do or develop software internally, which was something new to the bank. This resulted in several issues. The person who wrote the requirements long left the bank, and the team that tested it was uncomfortable accepting this software. So there were a lot of change requests, a lot of issues with respect to the quality of the software. So then before I was tasked to actually buy an off-the-shelf product and implement it. So I said maybe the traditional waterfall methodology was not working for the bank. So with what I did was basically try to implement the agile methodology. Again, it's not strictly agile. I know Chandan mentioned it, half agile, hybrid agile. This was a kind of agile that worked for us. We tried a small sprint to see with a modification of agile and waterfall model, will that work for the bank? And we did a small prototype and it did work. Once I got the senior management support for that, again, we had a very tough budget to live with. And to Stephen's point as well, risk-based testing was always there in the radar because there was no way we could test the software end to end. So basically, we had several challenges. And after we saw the results, successful results of the agile implementation, other offices in the world, like Singapore, UK, reached out to us saying that, hey, we are also exploring same off-the-shelf product, and I believe that you already have an existing product. Will that work for us? So we did a quick comparison of our CDD standards and their MAS standards in Singapore and the UK standards, and figured out that 95% of those standards are pretty much the same. It's the banking software. So basically, it's all the same throughout the world. And we implemented one for Singapore and for the UK. And that was a big success. Again, like I said, ours is not a software development firm, and we had about hardly 10 not developers, a 10-member team to test, to develop, it included an architect, it included someone who writes requirements, etc. So it was a challenge in terms of even environments. We really had to struggle with sharing environments with other projects and other teams. But at the end of the day, we just found out that waterfall was the issue for the project's failure to begin with. And then the agile kind of helped us, the modified agile, again, the hybrid agile kind of helped us move forward with the implementation. I would just leave it there at the moment, and I'll probably take any questions from anyone. But other than that, we had several issues and challenges, but I'm more than happy to speak to that later.
One thing you mentioned, Ram, was that effectively your different operating units in different countries are moving at different speeds in relation to agile adoption. Well, what would your tips be in terms of, as a very large financial firm, spreading best practice in agile, communicating the benefits, communicating how it works?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. This was one of the question. The board came here last year, I believe, or the year before. And one of the things that the board wanted to ask me was like, how is Agile a big success in the US, but
Yeah.
a moderate success in the UK? Again, the core fundamental belief that I have is that having everybody in the same location, because in New York, it's a small office. We have only 2 floors, 350 employees. Meeting one-to-one, having these frequent conversations either in the cafeteria or in the drawing board or room makes a huge difference. Having all the stakeholders in one place is a big win, because in the UK they are spread all over the place, and that's the reason why it worked in Singapore as well, because it was a small office. We all knew who the parties are, etc. So I'm thinking maybe, again, it's my personal view, but having all these people in one location and having very few parties to deal with makes a huge difference, because here we have to deal only with the business and IT.
So fundamentally, it's about personal contact.
Exactly, personal contact and communication. Because if you're at any point off the chart, you can always come back to the course by correcting yourself. And the worst thing that you would lose is maybe 1 week's worth of development effort or whatever it is, rather than somebody writes a spec and then somebody develops it like a year later. Nobody knows what this is supposed to do. So we believed in like frequent. Agile talks about rollout every few weeks, but we felt that for our banking needs, it's every 3 months, and it really worked very well. So again, like I said, we tried to adopt the best practices from the Agile and the best practices from the waterfall, and try to connect the two.
Okay, good. Let me move to a question, because there's quite a big question. We've been talking about enterprise testing for enterprise implementations, but we've also been talking really a lot about automation testing. And we do have a question here. I'm going to read it out. I mean, I'm not, trying to. It's not my question, so I'm not, I'm not technically expert enough to construct this question myself. So I'm going to read it out. It's an interesting question. So Stephen, I'm curious as to how automation tests can find defects when we all know that this is basically for regression testing. Can automation really do exploratory testing? So Stephen, the question was to you, but equally, Chandan, I think after Stephen's responded to that, it'd be good to hear what you and Ram have to say about that, as you've also been covering the automation as a automated testing as a core topic. Stephen.
So I see kind of 3 main areas where automation without AI or machine learning can do more than just regression. And then there's a caveat in just regression that I also want to touch on. But so one area is dealing with client specific edge cases. So where we have either client customizations or we have a workflow pattern that is specific to an individual client, it is often very easy to forget that one client when making changes to the broader platform, and having automated testing to protect that client is really important, so that it's not just like, oh, client X, we need to run these other 5 tests, because it's really easy for humans to forget those 5 tests. If they're automated, they're built into the package, they just get done. So that's one, I think, very valuable case. Another is looking at the interaction between systems. It's fairly easy for one team to test their own changes, but to know the impact on my dependencies or the teams I depend on, knowing when or when not their changes are a risk for me. So again, having an automation suite that I can set up. In our case, we use Jenkins for a lot of our deployment processes. So setting that up as a Jenkins job that any other team can run to know when they're going to break my team's products is really important. So, and it's not exploratory testing, but it is a form of testing that is able to find defects. The third area is building out the practice, whether or not you think of test-driven development as a development process or a QA process is a really fine line. And that fine line between development operations and QA, I love that line is getting more and more blurry. But that idea of your automation tests are, what is an automation test? Whether is it a unit test? Is it an API test? Is it a scripted workflow test? Is it a database comparison script? There are a lot of different details that are in there, and further blending the lines to make sure that acceptance criteria are clearly written into user stories, so that it isn't just the old functionality that's being automated, it is within the sprint automating the tests for the current sprint's work. And of a special key there is the idea of negative acceptance criteria as well as positive acceptance criteria. If you expect certain searches to not return results, write tests that show them not returning results and also not throwing a weird error, because that's oftentimes that null versus zero return can blow up systems, and trying to figure out how to make sure that it fails gracefully when it doesn't or can't find results is a key thing. So those are sort of the three areas that I think automation testing, just without AI or machine learning, does add a lot of value. One of the complications that we run into in proving that value is a lot of times we don't write a formal bug for something unless it's found in UAT or in production. Sometimes staging, it's sort of a mixture into the staging environments, but in the dev and QA environments, following the agile practice, you find an issue, you go and you chat with a developer, these days over Zoom, but in the old days, showing up their desk, you work through it, you fix it. Nothing ever gets logged. So trying to show the number of defects found by automation, given that automation mostly catches defects in lower environments, the whole idea of shift left, find things as early as possible, means that there's less and less evidence of the value of the automation. So that's mixed in there. And that said, just regression testing, there is a lot of value in just regression testing, because that's what allows it's the verification of the assumption that all of the testing you did in staging QA environments holds true for your UAT and prod environments. So one of our big goals is to make sure that there is no human validation of UAT or of production, and that we can have automated sign-off on our release for those. We're not there yet, but that's kind of the idea of, if we want to get to where we can release 2 or 3 times a day, which these days, based on tech companies, is nothing. We're still at 2-week releases generally. But if we want to get to the point where it's very easy for us to do a point fix to release intraday, then that ability to have automated sign-off and to really be confident that the testing we do in a lower environment will hold absolutely true in a higher environment, that depends on automated regression testing.
Chandan, would you like to comment on that same question? Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, of course. So Stephen, that was like a comprehensive response. So not sure what are the additions I would do, but still. So one thing I would like to cover, what we are doing differently here is at the bank, is we have recently started with the unit test automation and the end-to-end automation, and finally also handing over to the business testing. So essentially, we are not limiting the use of automation suite that we have built or are building to the technology team or the testing team. It has been passed on to the development team to use it in the initial cycle before it comes to us for technology team. And as an extension to that, when we pass it under business testing or in or end-to-end testing, I mean, in the legacy terms or the waterfall model we used to call the user acceptance testing, it's no longer the case, but we have passed on to the business. So this also means that whenever a new change is deployed to the production, and if something goes wrong, they can run a pack of regression themselves to make sure that what else is broken to support the defects. So this is taken very, very positively by the operations teams.
And finally, Ram, would you like to comment briefly on that?
Sure, I'll make a very brief comment. So like both Chandan and Stephen opined to, we are basically using a risk-based approach, which means basically most of the testing is also done by the end users, instead of relying heavily on SIT. And over the last 4 years, we have also realized that there are certain rogue modules which we will be very, very careful to touch because lessons learned from past experience. And automation was never a big success here because of the time it takes for us to run one automation script versus testing it manually. We did the cost-based analysis and found out that we can rely heavily on SIT, not SIT, like developer-based unit testing rather than rely on some tools. But moving forward, we will be, now that the software is stable, we'll try to see if we can automate certain modules. But the software itself has several complicated paths and scenarios, so it's completely impossible to automate even like 50% of the application. Back to you, Matthew.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, we're out of time now, gentlemen, but thank you so much for dedicating some time to this event and explaining in so much detail what you're doing.